Make this the best Halloween ever by pre-ordering my 2 brand new books coming out soon. The first is Phantom Phenomena, a hand-picked collection of the all-time scariest stories I've ever received, accompanied by atmospheric illustrations and field notes. Then there's Appalachian Folklore, an extraordinary catalog of the chilling history, creepy folklore, and rich culture of the Appalachians. These release October 15th and 8th, respectively. Pre-order now on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. But hurry, because the first 100 pre-orders to verify via the link in the description or at eeriecast.com/verify will receive an exclusive hoodie and hardcover copy of Lore, a folklore horror novel.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Welcome back, my friends, where the coffee's hot and the company is, well, let's just say it's better not to ask too many questions. Just yesterday, an albatross came in, looking all kinds of sad, with a tiny little man strapped around his neck, whispering something about regret. You think that's weird? Stick around after midnight. It gets stranger. Speaking of lonely figures trapped by their circumstances, ever wonder about lighthouses? Sure, they guide ships through the fog, but what if those beacons are calling out to something else? Things that lurk in the mist, waiting for the light to fade. Things you wouldn't want to see, even if you could. Today's episode features an assortment of true and scary work stories about the creepiest place to work: lighthouses. Pour yourself a cup, take a nice big sip, and brace yourself. These are tales from the break room. I'll never forget her. From Willie the Wisp. The old lighthouse had been a part of our lives for as long as I could remember. It stood there on the edge of the beach, a crumbled, broken old structure. The top half had collapsed years ago before we were even born, leaving behind a broken tower that all the local kids, including us, thought was a bit eerie. For me and my friends, Kyle, Zoe, Milo, and Avery, the lighthouse and the surrounding beach was our playground. We'd spend hours there after school almost every day. We built sandcastles, splashed in the waves, explored the rocky shore for interesting shells and sea glass, or just played hide and seek in the nearby forest. Our parents always warned us to be careful around the old ruins, though, which to me today makes sense. Looked like the old thing would collapse in on itself at any moment, and yet to us, it was just another part of the landscape. That summer evening, we'd been on the beach since late afternoon. I remember my skin being all sticky with salt and sunscreen. The sun was just beginning to dip towards the horizon. Things were steadily getting darker, but we could still see plenty well. This meant it was almost time to head home, but none of us were quite ready to leave. We were arguing about whether we should play Water Monster or something else, before Kyle just sprinted into the water saying that the last one in is a rotten egg. And back then, you took that seriously. You didn't want to be the rotten egg of the bunch. So the rest of us followed, shrieking with laughter as the cold water splashed around us. We were so caught up in the game that, at first, we didn't hear it. But then, it cut through the laughter like a knife. A sound that made us all just freeze to the spot like a bunch of small statues. A woman's scream, high-pitched and terrified, coming from the direction of the old lighthouse. We all turned instantly, water dripping from our clothes. Together we stared at the ruined tower. For a moment everything was still, and I thought we'd heard something else, maybe some sort of weird night bird. But then suddenly a figure in what appeared to be torn clothes stumbled out from behind the lighthouse, running towards the forest that bordered the beach. In seconds, the figure had disappeared in the trees. "Who was that?" Zoe whispered. She looked a bit creeped out. "I think someone got hurt," Milo suggested. We stood there quietly for a moment. I don't think any of us knew what we were supposed to do then. But then Avery spoke. "We should go check it out." "Not me," I said. I had blurted it out almost instinctively. The mere thought of me going towards that noise made me feel real fear for the first time. What if it's dangerous? But what if someone needs help? Zoe countered. Our friend group argued back and forth, torn between fear and curiosity. I wanted nothing more than to just run home, pretend we hadn't seen or heard a thing. But then Kyle turned to me. He had a gleam in his eye, one that I recognized all too well. I double dog dare you to go look. One of my friends gasped, another huffed with amusement. A double dog dare was serious business in our group. To refuse would mean being labeled a coward, something I couldn't bear the thought of. I swallowed hard, trying to hide how scared I really was. Well, I triple dog, I tried to say, but Avery caught on to me immediately. Nope, I said it first, you can't do that. I looked towards Milo, who had always been a bit closer to in the group, but he nodded, saying, he's right, he called it first. So there I was, with all my childhood friends turning against me. I'd been chosen to explore the most terrifying noise I'd ever heard. Fine, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'll go. I began to walk towards the lighthouse, my feet feeling like lead with every step. The others followed me a little way behind, but they stopped about 10 yards before the ruin itself. As I approached the broken doorway, I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The inside of that old lighthouse was dark. The fading sunlight barely penetrated the gloom. What was left of the wooden floor creaked ominously under my feet, and in some places it had rotted away entirely, revealing dirt and foundation underneath. I stood just inside the entrance, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just broken wood and crumbling stone and years of accumulated debris. I was about to head back, to tell my friends there was nothing there to be concerned about, when I heard it again. The scream, closer this time, but more breathy, I think. Or maybe hoarse is the right word. It was coming from ahead of me in the room. I jumped, nearly falling through a hole in the floor. My eyes were adjusting more to the dark by then. I began to see that there was movement in the dirt, movement that had likely been there the whole time. Slowly, I crept forward. What I saw next will haunt me for the rest of my life, and I'm not saying that lightly. There, half buried in the loose soil, was a woman, her hand pale and dirty, clawed weakly at the ground beside her. The rest of her body was obscured by the dirt, as if someone had been in the middle of burying her, and then suddenly stopped. I stood there, unable to move, unable to comprehend what I was looking at. You gotta remember I was just a kid, too young to understand or too young to try. But still, driven by some kind of force I couldn't understand, I moved closer. I knelt down next to her, and with shaking hands, I began to brush away the dirt that was on her face. As I uncovered her features, her eyes fluttered open, and they suddenly fixed on mine, wide and filled with fear. For just a second, we stared at each other, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Maybe I'd startled her. Maybe she felt hopeful for a moment, having been found. But then as quickly as I'd seen that flicker, the light in her eyes faded and her body went still. I could no longer hear her breathing. I scrambled backward, my mind unable to process what happened, that I had just watched someone die right in front of me, only inches from me, and she'd stared right into my eyes as she passed, my face being the last thing she ever saw. Suddenly, right then, I heard my friends screaming from outside the lighthouse. Their voices sounded panicked. As my mind cleared, I made out what they were saying. Run. Get out. I then turned towards the entrance, ready to run like they said, but then I saw them. The figure in torn clothes we'd seen run into the woods was now standing there, blocking the only doorway. Even in that dim light, I could see that their clothes were caked with dirt and what might have been blood. That stare down with the strange figure felt like it lasted ages, It was the most terrified I'd ever been, even all these years later. I then saw a shape in the air moving fast, and then there was a thud as whatever it was struck the figure in the head. The figure stumbled, dropping to one knee, when my friends suddenly screamed in unison, "Run!" I didn't need to be told again. I bolted for the entrance, squeezing past the figure as they tried to regain their footing. I ran faster than I ever had before. My friends already ahead of me on the beach. I saw Milo drop a rock, and I immediately knew that the object that had hit that figure in the head was a rock thrown by one of them. My friends had saved my life, and I would later find out it was actually Avery who threw the rock that incapacitated the stranger. None of us stopped running until we made it back to the road that led to our neighborhood. We lived on the same street. Panting and terrified, we all went our separate ways, too scared to even discuss what had happened. I ran straight to my house and up to my room, ignoring my parents' questions about why I was back so early. I dove into bed, pulling the covers up over my head, and I stayed like that all night. My child mind could not get the shape of that figure out of my mind. I kept thinking whatever that stranger did to the girl, he could do to me. So what if he followed me home? But morning came, and nothing happened. Life went on as normal, but I was changed. I could not bring myself to tell anyone what I'd seen inside the lighthouse. Not my friends, not my parents, not even the police, when they showed up asking questions about a missing woman a few weeks later. But you have to understand, I felt so guilty. Even now, as an adult, I feel guilt for not telling someone. Back when I was a kid when that happened, it felt like when I witnessed the woman's last moments, I'd become responsible somehow. I was so sure that if I did tell someone, I would get in a lot of trouble, even be sent to prison. So I kept quiet, carrying that weight with me. I eventually grew up, moved away from that seaside town, and tried to put the memories to rest. But when you see something like that, especially when you're so young and impressionable, you don't forget it. I'm not lying when I say I've woke up before, screaming, or at least thinking I was screaming, after reliving that moment in my nightmares. When work or other aspects of my life have me stressed or down, I'll sometimes have a dream of finding that figure in the torn clothes standing over my bed, ready to do to me what they did to that woman. You could even argue that the guilt I feel now is probably worse, because now that I know I could have said something and didn't, I feel horrible. We could have caught whoever did that to her, but now I have no idea if they did. No idea if they even found that girl. And to this day, I don't know who she was. To the woman I found in the lighthouse, I'm so sorry. The Lighthouse, from ClarkeMerten. I tell this story only because it sticks to me like a piece of gum on my shoe. I would love to forget it. It stays with me like a musty smell, and every time I come to the Oregon coast, it makes me feel cold and lonely. The only thing I can do is try to pass it on, and hope someday I'll be rid of it. I've told it many times before around campfires on the beach. I've seen the eyes of the people listening. Thankfully, the story never stuck to them, and I always continue holding the tale myself, with the weight of its eerie contents. The lighthouse was commissioned in 1870-something in the Oregon coast. The location was chosen because of its height along the coastal shore and its rugged projection into the Pacific. It reached into the ocean like the Statue of Liberty's arm and would help guide the ships away from the rugged coast and towards the safety of the nearby bay. The first tragedy recorded took place when the walls of the lighthouse were being constructed. The outer and inner walls of the building were being built simultaneously. Once the two walls had firmed up, wet concrete was poured into the crevice. This process continued, and the tapered form of the lighthouse began to take shape. It was a foggy morning, and the chill of the ocean air was numbing. The winds began to blow, and suddenly a gale-force wind struck. The scaffolding moaned and shuddered. The mechanism pouring the concrete folded. The men on the ladders jumped down from the walls and scattered like rag dolls on the ground. After they gathered themselves and assessed the situation, they decided that the damage was done, and they would have to reconstruct the structure when the storm was over. It was the next day when they realized someone was missing. In their haste to get out of the storm and near panic and confusion, they hadn't accounted for everyone. They were missing a young man who had joined the crew a few days earlier. He was nowhere to be found. They had no idea where he was. Perhaps he had fallen into the churning sea. It sent chills down their spines, but the work must be done. They rebuilt the wooden structure to access the top of the lighthouse walls and the mechanism to bring in the cement. When they were finally able to look into the dark crevice between the walls, they could see a light-colored hat. They wouldn't admit it, but they may have found the final resting place of that young man. There wasn't any way to reach him, and there were no signs of life, so they determined that they would continue their work and complete the task. It was not their intention to entomb him in the concrete, but there seemed to be no other choice. This may only be a ghost story that is told around the driftwood fires on the beach. The only thing that makes it more real to me is knowing that on a cold winter night in the 1900s, a lighthouse keeper climbed up the spiral stairs of that lighthouse to replace a light bulb that had gone out during a storm. In the dark, he had a heart attack and died right there on the steps. He was found in the morning by his wife. She said he had a horrific look on his face. That's my story, short as it is. Hope it doesn't stick to you like it does to me. I regret being a lighthouse keeper. From omnicoreloop. The names and names of locations in the story have been changed for the sake of anonymity. In 1998, I worked as a lighthouse keeper at a place I'll just call Cape Hope. Pretty cliche, right? That's not its real name, but I want to keep the actual place under wraps. I'd been there for a few years already. It was about as exciting as watching paint dry most nights. I mean, I did enjoy the job. I liked the solitude and the rhythm of the waves. Occasionally, it was pretty thrilling guiding a ship safely through a storm. But nothing could have prepared me for the series of experiences I had. It started in the summer of 1998. It started like a usual shift. I clocked in when the sun was setting, did my usual checks on the equipment, and settled in for a long night of keeping watch. The sunset that evening was gorgeous, with oranges and pinks smearing across the sky, like some kind of kid had gone crazy with the watercolors. As night fell, the fog started to roll in. Now, fog is nothing new around a lighthouse, but this was different. It came in fast and thick. Before I knew it, I couldn't see more than a few feet past the windows. And the silence, that was the worst part. Usually you can hear the waves crashing and seagulls squawking, but that night, I couldn't hear a thing, like every sound outside was being smothered before it came into the lighthouse. I did my best to shake off the creeps and focus. I checked the radar, making sure the beacon was running smooth, all the boring and necessary stuff. At one point, I heard a weird hollow clang come from somewhere out in the fog. At first, I thought it was some of the equipment acting up, but it kept on coming every few minutes, like clockwork. And it didn't sound like any machinery I was familiar with. Now, I'm not the type to get spooked very easily, but something about that sound made me feel uneasy. I tried the radio, thinking maybe there was a ship out there having some trouble. But all I got was static. Not even the usual chatter from the Coast Guard or other stations. Just that hissing noise. as if the fog was somehow blocking the signal. I decided it was time to head outside and take a look around. You're probably thinking that's a stupid idea, right? But the idea was maybe I could spot whatever was making that noise. The moment I stepped outside, I felt as if I'd walked into another world. The fog was so thick, I could barely see my hand in front of my own face. And the air felt very heavy, almost wet itself, like it was trying to smother me too. I made my way around the lighthouse, slowly and steadily, trying to peer through the fog. Before long, I noticed something weird about our beacon. I'd seen that light cut through some pretty nasty weather before, but this fog must have been eating the light somehow. The beam just wasn't reaching half as far as it should have been. Then I saw something else, or maybe I thought I saw it, because just for a second, at the very edge of where the light could reach, there was a dark human-shaped figure that seemed a little off. It looked a bit too tall and a bit too still. The moment I blinked, the thing was gone. I told myself I was seeing things. A trick of the light, or rather a trick of the fog. Plus, you know the way your brain can be when you're creeped out and alone in the dark. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there with me. So I hurried back inside. I tried to laugh it off. As soon as I got back to the control room, I knew something wasn't right. It was subtle at first. A few things kind of out of place. My pen wasn't where I'd left it, and was now on the other side of the desk. Some of my papers from earlier had been shifted. It was just from me opening the door. Maybe a breeze swept in, I told myself. That clanging sound kept coming too. Sounded like it was getting closer every time. I went back outside to check a couple more times that night, trying to figure out what the heck that was. Each time, I swear I could hear footsteps crunching on the gravel, but when I'd go to look, there was nothing there. Later on, I saw that figure again too. Closer than before, much closer. Still hidden by the fog, but I was able to make out more details. It was tall, all right. Taller than any person I'd ever met. And the way it stood there perfectly still, just looking towards the lighthouse, made my skin crawl. I was trying to convince myself it was just a weird tree, but I knew that there was no tree there before, not during the day. I'm not ashamed to admit I ran back inside and locked the door in a hurry. I spent the rest of the night freaked out, eyes wide open, looking in the direction of any noise I heard. When dawn broke, the fog began to lift. The clanging noise faded away, and everything finally felt normal again. By the time my relief showed up, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, that all of that could be attributed to the thick fog. Almost. I was not completely convinced. You know how they say lightning doesn't strike twice in the same place? Well, whoever came up with that saying never worked at our lighthouse. After that night with the fog back in '98, things did calm down for a while. Skip forward to winter night 2001, a night that made the fog incident look like a walk in the park. It was early December. A nasty storm was brewing. I'd been at the lighthouse for over 5 years by then. I was no stranger to bad weather. But this storm was something else. The wind was howling like mad, and the rain was coming down hard. I remember thinking, oh boy, you're in for one heck of a night. I looked outside to see the lighthouse beam cutting through the rain and mist. As I did, the lights inside the lighthouse began to flicker. I was worried we were about to lose power from the storm. It was a rare occurrence, but it did happen. Luckily, we did have backup generators. I was in the middle of checking those generators when suddenly everything went quiet. Imagine that. A violent storm whipping against the lighthouse, shaking everything up even on the inside. Then the next second, it's completely quiet. That was when I realized silence could jump scare you. But that complete silence didn't last for too long. A few moments later, there were footsteps coming from the tower above me. Though I was creeped out, I was trying to be rational, thinking that someone had snuck in looking for shelter from the storm. But I knew that wasn't right, as I'd locked up tight when I started my shift. And in this weather, nobody would be crazy enough to try to scale the lighthouse from the outside to get in elsewhere. I was standing at the bottom of that spiral staircase, flashlight in hand, trying to work up the courage to go check it out. Eventually I did. It was like every step I took, it got colder. By the time I made it to the top, I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. And no, it should not have been that cold. Not with all the equipment running just fine downstairs. But it wasn't the cold that stopped me in my tracks. It was what I saw out the window. I kid you not, there were small handprints, like a child had been pressing their hands against the glass. I wiped them away, hoping it was just the remnants of someone placing their hands on the glass several days ago. The lighthouse does occasionally get tours. I've personally guided some kids from a local school through here to show them how it worked, but I didn't recall any tour recently. I then shone my flashlight out the window, praying that I wasn't about to see someone out there. And thankfully, I guess, all I saw was the storm, raging harder than ever. Then there was a sudden ice-cold gust of wind that blew right through me. Here's the kicker. All the windows were sealed tight. So where would the breeze have come from? Omnicore! I heard someone call my name. The storm outside had picked up just before I heard it, as if to mask the sound. So it was faint at first, barely audible over the returned howling of the wind. But it was certainly there, coming from the top of the stairs I had just climbed. A deep voice, distorted, like it was calling to me from underwater. That's when I ran, bolting down the stairs so fast, I nearly tripped and broke my neck. I didn't stop until I was back in the control room, door locked behind me. I tried the radio, but the storm had knocked out the communications apparently. I was on my own, trapped in what I hoped wasn't a nightmare. When I thought things weren't going to get any worse, the footsteps started again. They were different, louder, and heavier, like whatever was up there was now dragging something behind it. The sound echoed down the staircase, getting closer to the control room door. I grabbed my flashlight again, as if I was about to do something, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the control room. So instead, I peeked out the door. I shone my flashlight into the hallway, and I swear I saw something move, just out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting away just as I turned to look. And then the tower door, the one I had made darn sure to lock, started to creak open, slowly, inch by inch, like something on the other side was pushing against it. I was frozen then, just standing there and watching it happen, as if I was waiting for, God, I don't know, anything. But nothing came through. The door just sat there after creaking open for a moment, swaying gently in a breeze that shouldn't exist inside a building with closed windows. Omnicore. My name was spoken to me again. The same deep, distorted voice, but this time right next to me. So close, I swear to God, I felt breath on my ear. I literally jumped up, screamed, and slammed the door shut, locking it, all in rapid succession. I spent the rest of that night huddled in the control room, goosebumps all over my body. The storm raged on outside, and every now and then I'd hear a thump or a scrape coming from up the tower. There was something still up there, still moving around. When morning finally came, my relief showed up. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost, despite these terrifying experiences, they were so far between, I didn't quit my job or even consider it. I mean, if you get a couple spider bites at the house you live in, maybe once every few years, you don't just consider moving. Maybe that's my comparison to help me cope. But I wish I had quit. I wish I'd walked out when the relief got there and never went back. Because this brings me to what happened that night in 2003. This would be the reason why I left the lighthouse for good. At that point, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right with that lighthouse, especially after the night in 2001. But I kept on clunking along, assuming that these were very rare occurrences, that I had been unlucky, and that nothing weird may ever happen again there. It was late autumn that year. The sky was dark and clouded over completely. Couldn't see the moon or a single star in the sky. Just a big black void, pretty much. And the sea, I'd never seen it so calm before. Usually the waves are constantly churning, crashing against the rocks. But that night it was almost like a flat and still mirror. That was unnatural. The whole scene was just unnatural. I remember standing outside the lighthouse, looking out over that impossibly calm water, just bewildered by it. It gave me a chill down my spine. But that night wasn't cold. Not really. At the beginning of my shift, a mist began to roll in from the sea, and it reminded me all too much of that fog from '98. Dense, thick, muffling the sounds and sights around you. I was looking around, trying to gauge how far I could see in the fog, when I saw something out there in the water, barely visible through that mist. I kid you not, it looked like a shipwreck. Half submerged, covered in barnacles and seaweed. From the shape of it, the ship looked ancient. Keep in mind, I knew that stretch of coastline like the back of my hand. I'd been working there for a long time, and I swear on my life, that shipwreck had never been there before. It was like it simply appeared there out of nowhere. Or maybe it came with the mist. I felt the temperature dropping rapidly then. I remember feeling quite cozy, to immediately shivering, and eventually I could see my breath, even in the mist. I hurried back inside the lighthouse then. But that didn't help. That cold temperature seemed to follow me, and that bad feeling was coming to me, that I was in for another one of those encounters. I went right to my safe place, which ended up being the control room. It was also my warm place, as I had a portable heater set up in there. As I settled into the control room, warming myself up, there was a sound. No, it wasn't the clanging sound from the first encounter, not my name being called like the second. As I listened, it sounded like breathing. Deep, slow breathing, like something very, very big was asleep nearby. I cautiously checked the windows, thinking maybe the wind was blowing in a weird way, making it sound like a big slumbering thing was breathing. But there was no wind that I could tell, and yet that breathing sound seemed to fill the room. Then the lights began to flicker, not like a power surge this time, more like a rhythm. It was almost like they were pulsing in time with the breathing. I grabbed my flashlight and began to check around the room, looking for anything out of place, an explanation to ease my mind. As I swept my beam across the room, I saw something move. There was a shadow darting along the wall. I whipped around, pointing the light where I'd seen it, but it was gone. And yet, it kept happening again and again. A shadow moving just out of sight, always disappearing when I tried to focus the beam on it. It was like being watched by a room full of people, but every time you turned to look at them, they vanished. Then, of course, the footsteps returned. I'd heard them years before. They were coming from the top of the tower, heavy, deliberate steps moving down the spiral staircase. They were getting closer to my room. My heart was pounding. I stood there staring at the staircase, waiting for whatever was making those sounds to appear. But nothing did, and when they reached the bottom, the footsteps just stopped. I then saw the mist seeping in through the cracks around the door. It began to curl around my feet, thick and cold, making the air feel heavy inside the lighthouse. It moved in ways mist really shouldn't. It seemed to swirl in patterns that made my eyes hurt the longer I looked. The breathing was getting louder too and closer, before eventually sounding like whatever was making the sound was right behind me. At that moment, I spun around, but the room was empty. Just me, that sound, and the mist. But then, the sound changed. The breathing turned into a growl, low and deep, but growing. I watched as a pen on my desk rolled right off by itself, and papers fluttered like they were caught in a breeze, and yet there was no wind. The wrench I'd left on the counter began to clatter to the floor. All the while, the growling got louder, angrier. Something was in that room with me, something that wanted me to know it was there. Without warning, the door to the control room slammed shut. The bang was so loud, so sudden, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I then ran to the door, trying to open it back up, but the handle was cold as ice and wouldn't budge. I'm telling you, it was so cold, it burned my hand. I desperately grabbed it again, holding on tight and pulling harder, throwing my whole weight against it, but I just couldn't get it to move. It felt almost like something was holding it from the other side. The growling had turned into a full-on snarl by then, an animal sound no human throat could make. I then heard a scraping sound outside the windows. When I turned to look, the mist outside was moving and swirling faster and faster, coalescing into a shape. Slowly it formed into something I'd seen before, years ago. That tall, dark figure. But this time it was plain as day. It was humanoid, sort of, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and where its face should have been, there was nothing. Just a blank expanse of darkness. The figure started to move towards the lighthouse. I was frozen as it approached the entrance and disappeared from view. The temperature in the room plummeted further. The growling filled the room, pressing in on me from all sides, and then the door burst open. The mist poured in, flooding the room in moments. It was so cold, I could barely breathe anymore. It felt like I was underwater, pressure pushing down on me from every direction. And I could feel something in the room with me, something very angry and full of hate, something that didn't want me there. I heard one final snarl, the loudest yet. Whatever it was right there in front of me. I couldn't see anything through the mist, but I knew if I had reached out then, I would touch it. For some reason then, I had a thought that this wasn't a ghost story or some paranormal occurrence I would laugh about later. This was real and dangerous, life-threatening danger. Luckily for me, the mist began to recede, and as it did, I made a mental decision that I was going to leave the lighthouse. I was going to leave and never come back to this place. Whatever was haunting it, whatever had been tormenting me off and on for years, I didn't think it was going to let up, and I wasn't going to stick around to see how worse it would get. As soon as the mist was gone and everything died down, I walked out of the lighthouse and left in my car. At sunrise, when my relief would have come in, I called to let them know that I wouldn't be there. When my higher-ups began to call me, likely wanting to ask what the heck had happened and why I'd left my post without warning, I didn't answer. But I didn't just quit either. I moved inland, as far from the coast as I could get and afford, and I never set foot in another lighthouse since then. Heck, I can barely go back to a beach or coastline without some sort of PTSD making me tremble and get really nervous. I don't know what was in that lighthouse, but it was very real, very powerful. To anyone else out there that works in or around lighthouses, all I can say is good luck. Trespassing at a certain Maryland lighthouse. From IWontTell. Because we were dumb kids back then doing dumb things, the names in this story will be changed. It was the summer of 2007. I was 15 years old. My friends, Ethan, Darius, and I had a brilliant idea to explore a local lighthouse to us. We'd heard it was haunted, with a history dating back to the Civil War. The local stories ranged from ghostly soldiers to unexplained lights. But we were skeptics. Until that night. It began with Zane, a guy from our class. He told us about strange lights he'd once seen at the lighthouse. "I'm telling you," he said, "there's something weird going on there." He explained this to us during lunch one day. I remember rolling my eyes, but his story did plant the seed of curiosity. A week later, we found ourselves in my old Corolla, parked near the lighthouse just after sunset. The plan was simple. We were going to sneak in, look around, and prove to ourselves that ghosts were just stories. We were armed with flashlights and an overconfidence that only teenagers possess. As we approached the lighthouse, I recall Ethan nudging me, saying, "Hey, you sure about this?" I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "It's just an old building. Nothing bad's gonna happen." Darius chimed in. "Bad like ghosts or bad like getting arrested for trespassing?" We laughed at him, but I could tell we were all a bit nervous, mainly about getting caught. The lighthouse was ahead of us, and at the time there was a thin fog over the water, giving off some creepy vibes. As we got closer, I started to feel watched, but I chalked it up to my slight paranoia of getting caught. When we made it to the door, Ethan jokingly pretended to pick the lock, saying, "Allow me, gentlemen." The goofball even bowed. I rolled my eyes and reached past him to try the handle first. And to my surprise, it turned. The door swung open with a loud creak. We exchanged glances. "That's, convenient," Darius said. He sounded more nervous than before, though I took the door being unlocked as a good sign. "Maybe they forgot to lock up," I suggested. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the dark. The interior was dusty and filled with some old furniture. Looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "It's freezing in here," Ethan commented, rubbing his arms. He was right. The night was a warm summer night outside, but the air inside the lighthouse was pretty dang cold. But I guessed maybe the place didn't have air conditioning, and if it did they even use it anymore? We began to explore, keeping close to each other. But being in a lighthouse, our focus was the light tower, which in this particular lighthouse was really just a small upstairs room. Just so you know, it's not one of those big cylindrical lighthouses. This place looked more like a schoolhouse from back in the day, with a tall jutting room at the top where the light was. As we made our way up, we began to hear a faint scraping sound from below, echoing up towards us. Darius froze right there. "Did you guys hear that?" "Darius, it's probably the wind, a cat, a raccoon, anything," I said. Halfway up the stairs, a sudden cold draft rushed past us, nearly making me drop my flashlight. We paused and looked at each other. "Dude," Ethan said to me, "you did close the door, right? There shouldn't be a breeze in here. What if the scraping sound was you not closing the door when we came in?" "I did, man," I replied. But at this point, I was being gaslit enough that I started to believe that I didn't close the door. Before we started to move again, we heard a faint voice coming from the direction of the entrance. It was too quiet to make out words, but it definitely sounded like someone was here in the building with us. "That's not funny," Darius said, his voice slightly shaky. "We need to go before we get caught." "We've come this far," Ethan argued. "They're not gonna know we're here if we stay quiet. We have to reach the top before we go, at least." Against my better judgment, I agreed with Ethan, so we continued our climb. Darius wasn't about to go anywhere without the other two of us. When we made it to the top, we found the door to the lantern room locked. Ethan tried to force it open, but this one wasn't going to budge. After a few seconds of trying, he stopped, caught his breath, and looked like he was deep in thought, probably trying to figure out a way we could get in. When suddenly, there was a deafening bang from the other side of the door, as if someone had tried to tackle it from the other side. All three of us jumped, hearts racing. Without even trying to lower his voice, Darius threw his hands up in the air and said, "That's it, I'm out." This time we didn't argue with him. Ethan and I followed close behind. As we descended, it felt like the cold got worse, but then we heard a noise behind us, the sound of the lantern room unlocking and opening. "Run," I whispered, and we all raced down the stairs, nearly barreling over each other. Just as we made it to the bottom, the front door slammed shut with a deafening crash. Ethan ran up to it, trying to yank it open, but it wasn't moving. "Come on, Ethan, it locks from the inside, dude. What are you doing?" "I know that, but the lock isn't locked here, see?" He showed me the handle. "But it's not turning, I'm telling you, it won't open." We began to hear footsteps coming from the lantern room down the steps we had just descended towards us. And then Darius, more freaked out than I'd ever seen him, just screamed, "Let us out!" And as if to answer his cry, the door opened. We did not hesitate. The three of us raced outside, not stopping until we made it back to my car, which we'd parked behind some bushes. We sat there, completely dumbfounded. Ethan was the first to say something, but he was still whispering. "What was that?" I shook my head. I didn't know. None of it made sense. There was no one else in the building. No one came in or out, so what caused the noises? What caused the door to not open, despite being unlocked? Ever since that event, it's become the ghost story equivalent of an inside joke with my friend group. From time to time, we'd be hanging out when one of us would say, "Remember when we went to the lighthouse?" And even years down the road, the topic being brought up gave me chills, but also a smile. I mean, at the end of the day, it was a cool experience. Something I'm glad I got to be there for. But I learned my lesson. Don't go breaking into lighthouses in the middle of the night, even when the door is unlocked. That's just begging for trouble. Beware the False Light. From Tom B.B. I've been fishing the waters of my hometown for over 30 years, and there's one night in particular I'll never forget. Back in 2003, me, Eddie, and the new guy, Rob, were out on my boat. This was to be a routine night fishing trip, something we had done 100 times before. There was no warning that the storm would come. The night was perfect, clear skies and calm seas, and plenty of bites. We could see the lighthouse in the distance too, its beam sweeping out over the water like clockwork. So if something bad did happen, we'd be able to make it back okay. At the time, Eddie and I were swapping old stories, trying to one-up each other while Rob listened, probably wondering if we were full of it. I remember thinking how still everything was at the moment. There was no wind and barely a ripple on the water. It was almost too perfect, you know what I mean? Like the calm before a storm. Well, turns out that's exactly what it was. It happened fast, unnaturally so. One minute we were laughing, and the next the sky went black. We were swallowed up in a darkness unlike anything before. Clouds rolled in out of nowhere, thick and angry, blotting out the moon and stars. and the wind picked up very suddenly, nearly knocking us off our feet. We scrambled to secure everything as the waves started to build. Within minutes, we were in the middle of the worst storm I'd ever been caught in. I swear the rain was coming down so hard it was like a waterfall, and the waves were so high I thought we were going to capsize. We could barely see a thing. The only reference point we had was the lighthouse beam cutting through the dark. Then things got worse. I glanced at the lighthouse through a break in the rain, but something was wrong. Its light was flickering now, dimming and brightening like a broken bulb. Eddie said it was just the storm, distant waves so tall, momentarily blotting out the light. Rob looked terrified. Can't blame him, it was his first season with us, and this was one heck of a welcome. I tried to steer us toward the light, but it vanished, just like that. Before I could even process what was going on, it reappeared, way off to our left now, much further off than it should have been. I thought I was losing my mind. Lighthouses don't move, right? I assumed it was the waves bouncing us further out, making me lose my bearings. Before long, I was certain it did in fact move. It kept disappearing and reappearing each time in a different spot. Sometimes it was closer too, other times further away. It was like it was toying with us. I'd never been so disoriented. Eddie grabbed the map and compass, but that was useless. The compass needle was spinning like crazy, and nothing on the map made sense anymore. The boat was taking on water. Waves were crashing in over the sides, and I was fighting just to keep us upright. That's when Rob said he heard something. At first, Eddie and I thought he was just panicking, but then we heard it too. There was a low hum, almost like a voice, coming from somewhere out in the storm. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the light, a siren's call beckoning us towards it. Despite how obviously weird that was, we had no choice but to follow the light. It was our only hope of getting out of this mess. But the closer we got, the worse things became. The waves were so bad then, it felt as if the ocean itself was trying to push us towards the light. The wind howled so loud, we had to scream over it just to hear each other. As we got nearer, I realized something wasn't right about that light. It was too low and too spread out. It didn't look like the beam of our lighthouse. It was more like a glow, like something you would see deep underwater. That's when it happened. Something moved under the boat, something huge. A wave hit us then so hard, I thought we were about to sink. We all grabbed onto whatever we could, holding on for dear life. Eddie yelled that we should turn back. But to where? The storm was all around us, and that light was our only guide. The light continued to flicker. The hum grew louder, and I was beginning to think we were actually going in circles. We weren't getting any closer to shore. We were being led out to sea. Rob was the first to see it. He pointed into the water, his face white as a sheet. At first, I couldn't tell what he was looking at, but then I saw it too. A massive dark shape moving beneath the surface. It was too big to be a whale, too fast to be a reef. It moved with the light too, like the two of them were connected somehow. I had a thought then. What it reminded me of was those deep sea fish, the ones with the glowing lure that attracts prey. But this would be a different scale. Surely I was just losing my mind and desperate for an explanation to cling on to. I tried to steer away from the light now, but it was like the boat had a mind of its own, or rather something was pulling us in. Just when I thought we were surely going to die, the light went out. There was complete darkness. The wind still howled and the boat lurched like it had been suddenly released. For a moment, all we could hear was the storm and our own panicked breathing. As if by some miracle, the clouds parted just enough for us to see the real lighthouse. Its beam was back in our view, clear as day. It was far off in the distance, further than usual, so we were way off course, but it was there, steady, unmoving, and definitely not blinking in and out. I've never been so happy to see anything in my life. We didn't speak as we steered toward the true light. We were all out of breath, terrified, and ready to touch solid ground. That wasn't just a storm. It was something else entirely. But what that something else truly was, I will never know. We made it back to shore in one piece, but things wouldn't be the same. Eddie quit fishing not long after. Rob actually stuck around for another season, but I could tell his heart wasn't in it. I'm still out there, because someone's got to fish those waters and put bread on my table. But I'll tell you this, I never do it at night anymore, no matter how tempting it might be. The fear of another freak storm occurring and a false light leading me out to my doom makes me lose sleep. Because what's stopping it from happening again? Call me crazy if you want, heck, sometimes I think I am. But I'd rather like to think I know what I saw that night. The ocean is the biggest and most mysterious place on our planet. Thanks for tuning in to Tales from the Break Room, the home of the scariest true work stories. If you want to hear your story narrated by me, send it to me at eeriecast.com/submit. We pay 5 cents per word for accepted stories. Help us grow by leaving Tales from the Break Room a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app. Check out eeriecast.com or search for EerieCast on those very same podcast apps to see our other exciting and terrifying podcasts, like Unexplained Encounters, the other show I host, where I read stories with a focus on the supernatural. To get some merch, go to eeriecast.store. And to unlock ad-free episodes of your favorite EerieCast shows and exclusive audiobooks, go to eeriecast.com/plus and consider signing up for EerieCast Plus. You can follow me on Twitter, I guess it's X now, at Prevails. You can also subscribe to me on YouTube, where I deliver the same content. Just look for Darkness Prevails. Good night. I hope we can share another break sometime soon.